So just make sure you draw an x and a y axis. Okay, so when you have this x and the y axis, what you have to realize is that every time in each quadrant there's certain things, certain characteristics. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw basically a bow tie. Yep. And these triangles basically will represent every triangle in that quadrant, in each quadrant. And then I'm going to draw. Okay, so we've got 4 triangles, yeah? This is my x, and this is my y. Okay, here's what I know. In this quadrant, what would you say about this length? Is it positive or negative? Okay, what would you say about this length? Okay, what would you say about the hypotenuse? Hypotenuse is always positive? If hypotenuse is always positive, then I can put a plus sign on all the hypotenuses, I don't know. Okay, well in this quadrant, what's the x? Okay, so I'll put a negative here, but that also means that one's negative, right? Okay, going up is what? Positive. Going down is? Okay. Over on this one, this is still positive, right? But this is negative. Okay, so I know all the signs of every one. Now let's talk about the sine, cosine, and tangent. If everything is positive, what does that mean to you about sine, cosine, and tangent? Sine, cosine, and tangent are all positive. Okay. So let's look in this quadrant. Sine, cosine, and tangent. Okay. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse. Positive over positive is positive. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, right? So negative over positive is negative. Okay, so that would be negative. And then what about tangent? Tangent is opposite over adjacent. Negative. Okay. What about over here? Okay. So sine is opposite over hypotenuse, which is negative. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, which again is what? Negative. And then tangent's opposite over adjacent, which makes it positive. Okay. Sine, cosine, tangent. Okay, so sine is opposite over hypotenuse, so sine is negative. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, so positive. And tangent's opposite over adjacent, so negative. Okay, what's positive in each quadrant? So what's positive in this quadrant? All of them. What's positive in this quadrant? Sine. What's positive in this quadrant? Tangent. What's positive in this quadrant? Cosine. Some people make up little sayings, like all students take calculus to remember, or something, just little sayings that they come up with to remember them. I think it's pretty easy to figure out which one's positive and negative in what quadrant, right? Here's what I know. Basically, here's what you need to think about. Cosine has to do with the x. Cosine has to do with the x, right? So for me, I just remember cosine and x. And sine has to do with the y, right? Opposite? So sine has to do with what? Y. Those are supposed to be arrows, back and forth, not negatives. So write those down. sine is y, y is sine. Cosine is x, x is cosine. Okay? So if you think about it, anytime the x's are positive, then cosine is positive. Anytime the x's are negative, then cosine is negative. Anytime the y's are positive, see on the y-axis these are positive, then sine is positive. And anytime the y's are negative, sine, then sine is negative. And then tangent is just a combination of sine and cosine. As long as you remember what that means. But I'm going to need you to be able to look at this and say, okay, if this is negative, that's positive, that means cosine is negative. You know what I mean? Sure, you can remember ASTC, and if that helps you, then that's fine. But I really, for the purpose of pre-cal and the purpose of calculus, you need to, and we'll talk more about this for sure, cosine is x and sine is y. Okay? What do we do in cal? Calculus is called the study of change. So like we do a lot of, if this is changing at this rate and this is changing at this rate, then how fast is this changing? Or, you know, if you've got a position modeled by this, what's the velocity modeled by? And if you know the velocity, what is the position doing? And if you know the acceleration, what's the position doing? What's the velocity doing? If you've got velocity, what's acceleration doing? Stuff like that. Lots of graphs. But it's different. It's analyzing for behavior, not so much like, so it's like you have to pull from all the stuff that you learned in pre-cal and algebra 2 and algebra 1 about functions, and then you just use those. And we don't use it as much. I mean, like, it's completely different from what you've done so far, which is what makes it more interesting. But anyway, okay, so there we go. Now we're going to use this, and we're going to find some trig ratios just like we've been doing the past few days, but instead of telling you specifically where it is, I'm going to give you clues, and you have to determine where it is. Okay? So everyone write down for me. Sine is 3/5 and cosine is less than 0. Sine is 3/5 and cosine is less than 0. Okay, was sine x or y? Y. You know how to remember that? X comes before y in the alphabet, right? Cosine comes before sine in the alphabet, yeah? So x and cosine, sine and y, right? Okay, so here's what I know. Sine has to do with y values, right? If sine is positive, where are the two quadrants where sine is positive? The top two. So draw an x and y, guys. And mark out those two quadrants. Because we know if sine is positive, it has to be in the top two quadrants, because sine is the y value. Cosine has to do with the x, right? So what does that mean when it says cosine is less than 0? It's got to be negative. Nothing's negative over here, so I know that I'm going to have to draw my triangle in that quadrant. So then what you do is you just draw a triangle. It really doesn't matter what it looks like. We could make it try and look like that, but don't care. I'm going to label my angle, and then I know that sine is 3/5. Sine is what over what? Opposite over hypotenuse. So if that's 3 and this is 5, -4. Don't forget that it's -4. Okay, so then you guys, what? So we're good? Okay. So you don't necessarily have to write all these down because you probably know them by now. But go ahead and tell me, guys, what is sine in this case? Sine is opposite of hypotenuse. Oh, we already know. Duh. So what's cosecant? Okay. So cosine would be, right, adjacent over hypotenuse, so -4/5, which makes this perfect. And then tangent is opposite over adjacent, so, and perfect. Okay? So what about this one? Write down tangent is -5/12 and cosine is greater than 0. Tangent is -5/12 and cosine is greater than 0. Mm-hmm. Okay. You pick whichever whichever one makes the most sense to you, you know, whichever one is easiest to you. To me, cosine being greater than 0 is easier to me as a clue. You know what I mean? So, cosine refers to x or y. Which one? Cosine has to do with x. So when is x positive? On the right-hand side, right? So I'm going to mark out those. Now, the fact that tangent is negative, it's got to be in the bottom because nothing's negative up here, right? Okay. When is tangent negative? There's only 2 quadrants where tangent is negative. Tangent is only negative here and here. Because here they're both positive, and here they're both negative, so they make a positive, right? So tangent's only negative here and here. So I just remember tangent is sine and cosine, and the only time tangent is negative is when sine and cosine are opposite signs. Does that make sense? So I could have said not this one and not this one, and since cosine is positive, it can't be that one. You know what I mean? But since I went with this clue first, then I just said, well, it's negative, so it's got to be down here. So now I draw my triangle. Do I draw it with the y-axis or the x? Always the x. Okay. Tangent is negative 5/12. Tangent is what over what? Now you need to be careful. Notice how the negative isn't this the same, negative 5/12, the same as 5 over negative 12? So you need to be careful. In this case, it's just as it seems what you would think, the way we say it, but you got to be careful because sometimes it's not. In this case, opposite, adjacent, this is the negative one. Yeah? Okay. Well, I know that it has to be 5 and 12, right? I know this has to be 5 and 12, right? Opposite over hypotenuse? I'm sorry, opposite over adjacent? This one is going to the right, which is a positive. This one's going down, which is negative. Yeah? Remember, in this triangle, this is positive, that's negative. So if I've got a negative 5/12, then it has to be a negative 5 and a positive 12. Okay? Yes? Well, just think, I mean, when you go this way, the x is negative. When you go up, the x is positive. When you go down, the y is negative. Right? This way, the x's are positive, but when you go up, it's positive. When you go down, it's negative. Guys, this is a Pythagorean triple, 5, 12, 13. Okay. So then tell me, what is sine? Sine is opposite over hypotenuse, so which makes this? Okay. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, so which makes this? Tangent is negative 5/12, which makes this? And there you go. We're good? Okay. Okay, I'm going to give you guys a minute to think about this one. Write down the clues, and then decide what quadrant we're in. Okay, did you determine what quadrant you were in? Okay, so first I want to hear some thoughts. Not like what it is, but why. Okay, you're saying cosine's negative and cosine is x or y? Cosine is x, so if it's negative, it's got to be on the left-hand side. I agree. Bottom down here? Okay. So since tangent is opposite over adjacent, if they're opposite signs, then tangent's negative. If they're the same sign, down and down, right? Or left and down, then it's positive, so yeah. Bottom left. We good? Okay, so I'm going to draw my triangle. Tangent is, or cosine is cosine is negative 2/5. So cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, right? So this is 2 and this is 5. One of them needs to be negative. It's got to be the 2. Okay? What does that make this? How do you know? Take the square root. So 25 minus 4 is 21, square root of 21. If you wrote that, would you be right? Nope. No? It's negative. Don't forget, you're going down, right? So if you're going down, that's a negative square root of 21. Does that make sense? Okay, so something you can't forget. Okay, now let's talk about sine. So sine is what over what? Opposite over hypotenuse. So negative square root of 21 over 5. Okay. So what does that make cosecant? Good. When you flip it, you got negative 5 over the square root of 21, but that means you're going to have negative 5 root 21 over, perfect. Okay, cosine is, well, we know, negative 2/5, right? So what does that mean secant is? Good. Okay, tangent is opposite over adjacent, which makes it what? Well, negative divided by negative is? Positive. Okay, so then cotangent is? And there we go. Okay, one more and then we'll be done. Tangent is negative 4/7, sine is greater than 0. Raise your hand if you know what quadrant it's in right now. Or you already know what quadrant it's in. Okay. There's one good answer to do. There's your first best too, and it's definitely not me. Well, you're sweet, but I don't know. Okay, so if tangent's negative, tangent is opposite over adjacent, right? So the only way opposite over adjacent is negative is if one of them is positive and one of them is negative, right? What do you know about this quadrant? It's all positive. Opposite and adjacent are both negative, which makes tangent Positive, so tangent's only negative here or here. And then sine is positive. Sine is x or y? Y is negative here and positive there, so it's got to be in this quadrant. Okay, so I'm going to draw my triangle. Okay, tangent is negative 4 over 7, so tangent is opposite over adjacent, right? I'm going to put a 4 here and a 7 here. But the 7 is the one that's negative. So when we read it, negative 4 7s, we automatically think the negative goes with the 4. But since the 7 is the one moving to the left and the 4 is going up, 7 is the only one that's negative. Alright, so then let's, what's the hypotenuse? How do I find it? Okay. The square root of 4 squared plus a negative 7 squared. So 16 plus 49. 65? Is there a perfect square that goes into 65? Well, shoot. That would have been more fun. Okay, so this is the square root of 65. Positive? Always positive? Okay. So then, I'll call on some people. Okay. Francisco, what do you think sine is? Good. 4 square roots of 65 over 65. You guys agree? Okay. So, Sam, what does that make cosecant? Good. Cosecant's reciprocal of sine. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse, so hypotenuse over opposite. Square root of 65 over 4. Cole, what do you think about cosine? Perfect. So then secant, what do you think, Ashton? Okay. I'm just going to bring the 7 up to the top and call it good. Okay, and then tangent, we already know. So then, William, what is cotangent? Okay, we're good.